Hello, my name is James Clegg. I work for the University of Edinburgh's Talbot Rice Gallery and I'm the curator of Pine's Eye. Pine's Eye is a large group exhibition that runs across the gallery's distinctive spaces. As the exhibition is closed due to the 2020 pandemic, I've decided to make a series of short videos that explore the work of each of the artists in turn. This week we're going to look at the work of Firelei Báez. We're showing her work, I Write Love Poems Too, The Right to Non-Imperative Clarities. Firelei was born in the Dominican Republic. Her mother is Dominican and her father comes from the neighbouring Haiti. These are countries that were divided by different colonial forces. So the island of Hispaniola was split by the French, who took Haiti, and the Spanish, who took the Dominican Republic. And this whole region became a kind of testing site for colonial projects. The huge movement of people, including African slaves who were brought into the region to run the plantations, and a huge shift in the ecosystems of these areas as well. When she was 10 years old, Firelei moved to the United States. And this gave her yet another perspective on the racial dynamics of this whole region. And she became very interested in something called the pigmentocracy, or the hierarchy that's formed between people who have different skin tones and skin colours. In one of her early works, she explores something called the brown paper bag test. This was something conducted in the United States as a means of determining the blackness of a person. So you would stand next to a brown paper bag, and if your skin was darker than the bag, you would be classified as black, whereas if your skin was lighter than the bag, you would be considered white, or white enough to be allowed whatever privilege was being tested for. So that might be access to a particular social club or to a particular party. Living in the United States, Firelei became very aware of the fact that people from the Caribbean were often denied a sense of history. It's almost like they came from this timeless other space. And also gained a sense that colonialism had really shifted and distorted some of the traditions and folklores of these islands as well. When she was young, Firelei was told stories about the Siguapa. These are female characters who have this amazing thick black hair and backwards pointing feet. Having backwards pointing feet means that you can easily trick people and mislead them, because if they follow your footsteps, they'll go in the wrong direction. But when she was young, Firelei felt that this character was being presented to her as a kind of an evil force, a bad spirit, a kind of a boogeyman of types. And this was almost like a moral lesson, as if you shouldn't aspire to the characteristics of this in fact, very powerful female figure. Firelei wants to turn this around. In fact, she literally changes the direction of this character's feet. These kind of Siguapa figures appear a number of times across the work that we're showing in the gallery. And what Firelei is really trying to do is to sort of turn this colonial mythology on its head, to empower this character, to say that actually this character's connection to nature, its unruliness, its power, even its kind of sexuality is something that can be celebrated and can be seen as a form of resistance. And we might actually see this work as being almost like a catalogue of these forms of resistance. We see a lot of colour and pattern across the work. And this is in part a reference to Firelei's interest in the tignon. This is a headdress that was enforced on women of colour in New Orleans. It was a way of restricting and regulating their bodies through their hair, almost as if their frizzy African hair was seen as a kind of threat or a kind of force that needed to be controlled. But these women started to adorn their headdresses to make them colourful and vibrant by adding patterns and ribbons. And through this making them into a kind of form of self-empowerment and self-expression. And we can see this influence through a lot of Firelei's work. These characters that have these heads that seem to open out into these colourful forms of enlightenment or knowledge or freedom or release. There's a real energy, a positive energy about them. And the Tignan can often become a kind of hybrid with other forms and shapes that Firelei is interested in. So Ido Wedo was this kind of spirit of rainbows and serpents who could grant knowledge to travellers. And we see that the Tignan kind of mixed with this serpentine form as well. Firelei is also mixing in across her work all kinds of stories and myths that relate to the African diaspora, but also looking to global forms of resistance. So we see a lot of clenched fists within this work that represent a kind of solidarity. We also see stone throwers as well, which are a kind of allusion to people in poor countries who face armored cars and tanks, and they do so by throwing stones at them. I mean, it's their only means of resistance. Ultimately, the stones are not going to damage their vehicles, they're not going to hurt anyone, but they at least show a willingness, a preparedness to fight back, to do whatever you can to reclaim yourself. A significant aspect of I Write Love Poems is that it's all created on found book pages. These are book pages collected in bookshops in New Orleans, or they were discontinued from various libraries. And they really reflect this way of looking at the Caribbean from the outside. They reflect this colonial attention to detail that is indicative of a greed and a desire for power. So they tend to include charts and diagrams and maps, things that really try to divide spaces and get this kind of scientific grasp and control over them. And Firelei works in a very expressive way over the top of these pages. So she allows her paints to pool and bubble and find their own form. It's like she gives them this kind of freedom before then starting to shape them into this catalogue of characters and spirits and stories and signs of protest. A lot of the works in Pin's Eye turn our attention towards the Caribbean and the Americas. And I think that the reason that this happens within the exhibition is because it's an exhibition looking at the relationship between people and nature. And this whole area was a huge testing ground for these colonial projects. When we think about the Anthropocene era, this geological era that we're living through in which people have left their traces on the planet, we shouldn't just think about pollution and materials, but we should also think about people. And the Caribbean and the Americas saw the largest displacement of people in the last 13,000 years. The population of indigenous people went from around 54 million after the arrival of Columbus to in 1650 about 6 million. This is a huge decimation of people and also a huge decimation of identities and cultures and knowledges about how to look after nature and look after the world around us. So it's a really significant part of that story, that relationship between people and nature. And I think this really shows how important Firelei's work is. This is an attempt to try to reclaim some kind of subjectivity that's been heavily repressed or forgotten. In addition to her extensive research that assembles this sort of catalogue of global resistance, Firelei is also using ideas from Afrofuturism to explore the kind of contact between the African diaspora and technologies and modernization, but also science fiction to make this kind of speculative project that can really energize and re-look at and reimagine what the future might become.